Yesterday, at Bangkok's Suvarnabhumi Airport, as I watched the bustling crowds, I couldn't help but think about the current state of airports and shopping malls in China. The contrast was disheartening. It's common for Chinese people to look down on Southeast Asian countries, assuming they're impoverished. Yet, the reality here tells a different story: a thriving market and robust consumer activity. In stark contrast, Chinese malls often stand empty and street shops are quiet. Do I even need to comment on China's economic situation? At Suvarnabhumi Airport, tourists from Europe and the United States make up the vast majority. The Chinese tourists, especially the so-called Chinese aunties who used to be everywhere, are almost nowhere to be seen. Why is that? The trade war seemingly hasn't dampened the consumption of Westerners, but Chinese tourist numbers have declined. Could this be evidence that Chinese consumption is indeed being suppressed? That's precisely what I want to explore in this discussion. Why do Americans have such strong consumption power, while Chinese consumers are relatively weak? And why hasn't China been able to develop a consumer market like that of the United States? Almost everyone knows that the United States is the world's largest consumer market. Americans consume voraciously, some might even call it wasteful. Yet, in countries like Japan, Germany, and those in Northern Europe, which offer better social welfare than the US, people tend to be more frugal. So, what drives Americans to spend so much? Do they earn more? In fact, the average American's income isn't particularly high, and many working-class individuals, often referred to as rednecks, have limited financial resources. Nevertheless, their consumption remains strong. Here's why. 1. Institutional factors. The US has a social security system that's quite unlike anything in mainland China. Even if you lose your job, you won't go hungry. There are provisions for child support, ensuring a basic standard of living. Charitable organizations and companies also regularly distribute goods. In such an environment, there seems little point in saving money. In China, people save heavily because they know that in times of trouble, neither the government nor their family may be able to assist. They save as a safeguard for the future. This constant saving directly curbs consumption, making it difficult for China to develop a consumption-driven economy like the US. The income distribution system is another major issue. In the US, labor compensation accounts for over 60% of GDP, and 95% of the non-agricultural population is employed. In China, although a large portion of the population is also wage-earning, labor income makes up less than 8% of GDP. This means that most Chinese people have low and often unstable incomes. How can they afford to spend freely? 2. Exchange rate disparities. When looking at local consumption, an American with a monthly income of $3,000 and a Chinese person with 3,000 yuan might seem to have similar spending power. However, when it comes to purchasing goods, the differences are stark. An American can buy a 60-inch Chinese-made TV for just $299, meaning they can afford 10 units in a month. In China, the same TV might cost an entire month's salary. An iPhone, priced at $799 in the US, allows an American to buy 4 per month, while in China, it takes several months' income to afford one. A pair of Nike shoes, costing $59, can be bought twice a day by an American, but in China, it costs nearly half a month's wages. Although the prices of these goods may appear similar, the purchasing power of the US dollar is far greater than that of the Chinese yuan. American consumers can afford foreign-made goods without financial strain. For example, 350 million Americans buy around 40 million TVs annually, almost the same number as 1.4 billion Chinese consumers. Americans might smash a TV out of anger, perhaps due to a political speech they dislike, a sports loss, or an upsetting news story, knowing they can easily replace it. Similarly, Americans often discard swimwear after a single use and buy new bedsheets every season, as these inexpensive goods from developing countries are negligible in terms of their monthly income. 3. Consumption habits. American consumption habits also play a significant role. Curtains in the US are typically replaced every 1 to 3 years, while in China, they often last over a decade. For instance, if you live in a house for 20 years, Americans would replace their curtains 6 or 7 times, whereas in China, it might only happen once. Americans also consume a large amount of energy. They leave air conditioners running 24/7 and use vast amounts of water for swimming pools and lawns without a second thought. In the automotive sector, due to the large geographical area, American families often own multiple cars and upgrade them as frequently as Chinese consumers upgrade their iPhones. Low taxes on consumer goods in the US stand in contrast to China, where high taxes on luxury vehicles like Land Rovers or Toyota Alphard suppress demand. Moreover, the large living spaces in the US drive up consumption of furniture and appliances. American households often have multiple sets of sofas, large refrigerators, and outdoor play equipment for children. High labor costs encourage DIY projects, leading to increased purchases of tools for car repairs, lawn mowing, snow shoveling, painting, and moving. Pet ownership, especially of dogs, is another significant factor. American pet stores are as large as regular supermarkets, catering to the extensive needs of pet owners. The consumer market for pets is huge. Hobbies in the US are also highly specialized, and niche interests are widely accepted. With demand comes a market. For example, there are numerous types of sports, each with a complete set of equipment from head to toe. In China, high housing prices mean people live in cramped spaces with little room for large items. Additionally, many Chinese workers face job insecurity after the age of 35 with unstable incomes. In such a situation, who dares to spend freely for excessive consumer credit? The US has a personal credit system, and the entire society is designed to encourage consumption. As a result, individuals are more willing to borrow money to spend. In China, although some young people have the habit of living beyond their means, without a job, they often have to rely on their parents. This, in turn, restricts their parents' consumption. Americans, with their social security system, don't worry about defaulting on credit card payments like many Chinese do. In China, if someone loses their income, they may find themselves crushed under credit card debt with no safety net. It should be noted that the above content contains certain subjective views and generalizations. In fact, the economic situations of China and the United States are complex, and factors affecting consumption involve multiple aspects such as history, culture, and policy, which require comprehensive and objective analysis. 5. The development of direct and indirect finance in the US. In the United States, direct finance is highly developed, while indirect finance is relatively underdeveloped. Commercial banks in the US generally do not accept small personal time deposits, only large denomination time deposits. As a result, it is quite difficult for ordinary Americans to engage in personal savings. Most of their savings are in retirement accounts, which are part of the direct financial system. Retirement accounts are mainly used for investing in bonds and stocks rather than for depositing money. What's the significance of this difference? Let's look at the M-to-date of China and the US. China's M-to can reach to 100% of its GDP, while in the US, it is only 70%. And this 70% mainly comes from non-resident sectors. M2 is created through deposits and loans. The relatively small M2 in the US is not because Americans are reluctant to take loans. In fact, their desire for loans is much higher than that of ordinary Chinese people. The reason is that the loan funds do not come from deposits, but from the capital of the financial system or direct financing. When there are fewer deposits in the financial system, it is reflected in a more vigorous consumption level. China also has a fairly developed direct financial system, but the problem of online lending is quite serious. On the surface, online lending in China seems to be invigorating the economy and stimulating consumption. However, due to its excessive proliferation, it actually drains blood from the consumer market, which is detrimental to the establishment of a healthy consumer market. 6. High productivity in the US. The relatively high production efficiency in the US enables a great abundance of goods and services. Underlying this is technology and innovation. Relying solely on consumption without production will eventually lead to depletion, creating what can be called a lazy economy. We can look at Argentina as an example of this. In China, although the production capacity is enormous, the direct profit is relatively small. It often relies on exploiting the labor force at the bottom, which is not a healthy economic model. With low wages, the public can only meet their basic survival needs but lack the ability to consume. 7. Housing prices. In the United States, housing prices are relatively low in areas other than major cities, which is quite different from the situation in Chinese cities. In China, due to the long-term implementation of the land finance policy, the government uses housing as a tool to amass a large amount of wealth, which severely restricts consumption. In contrast, in the United States, with relatively low housing prices, many Americans do not face significant pressure in repaying their mortgages. According to relevant laws and regulations, mortgage payments should not exceed 1/3 of the wage income, and the excess part can be applied for exemption. In such a situation, the consumption ability of Americans is unlikely to be dragged down by housing prices. As for the Chinese, after paying off their mortgages, they often have little ability left for other consumption. According to data from 2024, the proportion of Chinese residents' consumption in GDP is approximately 36.2%, while in the United States, consumer spending accounts for about 67% of GDP. Calculated per capita, the consumption ability of Americans is 11.3 times that of the Chinese. Of course, this is a macro-level view. In reality, the consumption ability of ordinary Americans may not be extremely high either. If you carefully analyze their bills, you will find that most of their income is occupied by various expenses such as taxes, rent, car insurance, water, electricity, and gas bills. In movies, it is common to see American housewives complaining about not having enough money to buy groceries. When we say groceries, we don't mean miscellaneous hardware tools, bags, sockets, etc., but the money for buying food and cooking. Even so, their consumption ability is still much stronger than that of the Chinese. Previously, the weak consumption in China was due not only to housing, but also to the too heavy burdens of education and healthcare. If you consider these two burdens as domestic demand consumption, well, China's domestic demand could be among the highest. I hope you understand what I mean by this. Despite what some experts say about the difficulties in establishing a consumer market, modern economy is actually quite simple. It can be summarized into two aspects: production and consumption. Ultimately, it all boils down to consumption because production is driven by demand and consumption represents the final demand. Therefore, consumption is the ultimate engine of economic development. It seems that Chinese officials have not always understood this inherent logic. I have said many times before that for a country, producing to meet the consumption needs of other countries is an export-oriented economy. The construction of factories, ports, transportation, and other infrastructure for the purpose of export, as well as the resulting urbanization, is what we call investment economy. When other countries experience stagnant growth, reduced demand, or they feel insecure about the external supply chain and demand the return of industries, China must establish sufficient domestic consumption demand to absorb these production capacities. This is what we call a domestic demand-driven economy. Currently, if this domestic demand-driven economy cannot be established, China's future looks rather bleak. Why didn't China attach importance to consumption before? The fundamental reason is that some people were worried that once the consumption level of the Chinese people rose to a certain extent, they would start demanding political rights. This is understandable because the richer the people are and the higher their consumption level, the more they will realize that they were just surviving before and now they want to live a better life, which requires certain rights. As a result, the people will demand more and more rights, which is a social law. For example, during the epidemic prevention and control period, communities composed of middle and high-income homeowners were more resistant to management than those composed of low-income residents. But the question is, can you keep the people's income low just because you don't want to grant them rights while still hoping to boost the economy? If you can't boost the economy, it will be impossible to continue its development. Domestic demand is a double-edged sword. While it can counter the containment efforts of the United States, it can also undermine the ruling foundation. In fact, this involves the issue of power transfer. I have always said that China should transform from the world's factory to the world's market. Many people didn't believe it, and their concerns were based on the issue of the ruling foundation, which is not entirely without reason. Reforming the distribution system to boost consumption was not impossible before, but some people were simply unwilling to do it. However, the situation has changed. If we still follow the old mindset of amassing a large amount of money and keeping the people living at a low standard, we will not be able to solve the problem of overproduction. Once the largest consumer market disappears, factory layoffs will increase, unemployment will worsen, income will decline, and consumption will further decline. Then, there will be no tax revenue. Without tax revenue, how can we maintain governance? So, just as suppressing consumption was once in line with a certain ruling concept, stimulating consumption now is also part of the same concept. I hope you can understand what I mean. Weak domestic demand and small domestic demand are two different things. The strong consumption in the United States is actually a relative concept, and behind it lies the US distribution and security systems. The weak consumption of the Chinese people is actually a question of the relationship between the people and the state. Is the state for the people, or is the state the master of the people? Well, guys, that's all for today's topic. Goodbye.